Have you ever sat and stared up at the stars and wondered, where did we come from? Let's take a journey like no other, not to a place, but to a time. Join us as we delve deep into the human past and explore our shared human origins. Welcome to the world of paleoanthropology. And welcome to the world of paleoanthropology. Today we have a very special guest from a wonderful new book. I'll hand it over so he can introduce himself.
Hi there, my name's Tom Higham. I am a professor of evolutionary anthropology. I recently moved from my former job, which was for 20 years at the University of Oxford's radiocarbon accelerator unit. And I've latterly been the director of that unit. But I took the opportunity to take up a new position recently at the University of Vienna in the Department of Evolutionary Anthropology, where I've been based, as I say, comparatively recently, since the beginning of August. And as Seth has just mentioned, I've written a book, and that's the book, the cover of the book there. And it's called The World Before Us, How Science is Revealing a New Story of Our Human Origins. Although in the US, the version that's just been released by Yale has a slightly different subtext. It refers to how the new science of our human origins. But nonetheless, it's the same book, aside from the fact that it's a different publisher. And the reason that I wanted to write this book was that I have been working in this field for around the last 20 years. And prior to coming to Oxford, I was a scientist working in the radiocarbon laboratory in my native country of New Zealand. So I worked in radiocarbon in the Waikato radiocarbon laboratory there. And most of the work that I did was actually focused on recent time. So the diaspora of the Polynesians was the thing I was most interested in, the settlement of New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And there, people reached the landmass of Aotearoa very recently comparatively to other places. So we know that people only made landfall there around 700 years ago, around 1300 AD. And so this leads to a whole lot of challenges of dating, very precisely dating the last 700 years. You can imagine it's difficult. When I came to Oxford, I got very quickly introduced to a colleague of mine called Roger Jacobi, who was a Paleolithic specialist. And there he was interested in much more ancient periods. So I got interested in the Paleolithic through him. And over the next few years, I worked on developing and modifying new ways of dating bone collagen to remove the contamination to get better, more reliable dates. So I started to work on a lot of Neanderthal, anatomically modern human or Homo sapiens sites across Britain first, and then across Europe, and then latterly right across Eurasia. And I was eventually very fortunate enough to work in Russia and places to the east. And it's there that I began to work with Russian colleagues who were excavating some of the sites in the Russian Altai, and particularly Denisova cave. So I became very interested in Denisovans following the 2010 genetic discovery of Denisovans through that work, through the Leipzig Max Planck group. And after a few years of working on that, I was invited to give a lecture tour back home in New Zealand. And I gave 10 lectures in about 12 days, which was pretty intense. Yeah. And after most of the lectures, I would there'd be people asking questions. And one of the questions that came up a bit was, is there a book about what you've been working on? And so I had to say there wasn't. And I decided that I would therefore try and fill the gap, as it were, and write a book so that some people could read more about the details of what we've been working on with a lot of other people. And so that's how this book sort of came to life and began. And it's been a very interesting and exciting journey. Quite a lot of work. Most of it was written in lockdown last year, which was challenging. I did most of it between the hours of about 5 and 8 o'clock in the morning. So, but eventually it was produced, and it's been well reviewed, I think, and hopefully a lot of people are enjoying or have enjoyed reading it.
Definitely. Sorry to interrupt you. Definitely, I loved it. Honestly, it's one of my favorite new anthropology books, and I think it's very insightful and will help educate a lot of people on this particular period of time in our history. And so, what led you to? I know you said you were shown certain things and you started working on Paleolithic things, but what led you specifically to this period? Was it because in Britain there
Mm.
were Neanderthal remains, or was it just your
Yes, I initially got interested in it because I work in the field of radiocarbon dating for the most part. And when you're radiocarbon dating things, you're dating things that are between the present day and around 55,000 years ago. And then beyond 50,000-ish, that's when radiocarbon that is residual, that is remaining from once living organisms disappears and there is no more to measure. And so by the time you're getting back to the period 30,000 plus, you're dealing with stuff, radiocarbon concentrations of less than 3% of what they are today. And that means that small amounts of contaminating carbon can really play havoc with the reliability of dates that you're going to get. And so for many, many years, we have had a situation where people have dated things from Paleolithic sites, and they've unfortunately been too young. And we know that now through the advent of superior technologies for decontamination and better ways of measuring radiocarbon, residual radiocarbon in bones and charcoal and shells and things like that. So my interest originally came from helping my colleagues to get better dates. And as I worked more with them and as I started to collaborate with them, I started to get much more interested in the kinds of questions that they were asking. When I was back in New Zealand, I actually studied, my first degree was in anthropology. And so I studied human evolution and human origins, and I taught courses on that at undergraduate level in my university at Waikato. And so I had some background there already, and this really brought it to me, brought it back to me in terms of this interest. And so, as I say, beginning to work on many, many sites. And as you do, and you have an area of specialization, you realize that in the 21st century, the way to answer really big questions in paleoanthropology, at least, is you've got to use multiple methods and you've got to be conversant with different methods. You know, it's very difficult nowadays to understand or to have conversations with all of the different specialists that there are out there in the field. You know, you've got to work with paleoclimatologists, you've got to work with geneticists, you've got to work with people who study seasonality, you've got to work with physical anthropologists who study skull shapes and cranial morphologies and the statistics of all of that. It's really, really difficult to, you know, be conversant in all of these various disciplines. I've tried really hard to get to grips with as many of these different fields as I can. And I'm aware that, you know, I'm very far short of expertise in many of these. But for that, I rely on a group of friends and colleagues who I contact and ask questions about. So it's, as I say, that the modern period is very exciting because we have a lot of really cool techniques that we can apply. But the first thing we have to start with are questions and projects and building teams and groups to work together on things. And there are lots of them out there. And as you know very well, Seth, hardly a week goes by or a day goes by that something really exciting doesn't come out in the literature about this wonderful field of paleoanthropology.
Oh, 100%. It's definitely a good time to be an anthropologist. So when we're talking about Denisova Cave, I don't remember off the top of my head how old the pinky bone and what was it, a tooth?
Yes, that Denisova 4 is the big tooth and Denisova 3 is the little pinky bone, that's right.
So what is the date range for those?
Yeah, so this was one of the big problems that we encountered when we first started working there. So overall, we know from previous work that the sediments of Denisova Cave go from the modern period, and I mean, by modern, I mean from the 1800s and even today, and they go right back to more than 300 or 350,000 years ago at the base of the sequence, about 4.5 meters below the current datum. So it's a very deep, well, not very deep, but it's a comparatively deep cave. It's very deep in terms of the Altai region. It's the best and the deepest sequence that we've got in the Altai, that's for sure. because many of the other sites are quite short, and they were occupied for the most part by predators like hyenas and bears. And so we've also got this, of course, parallel preservation of DNA there at the cave too. And so we have big advantages in terms of the site and sedimentation rates and so on. And then these very exciting fossils. Now, obviously, the big problem with Denisova is that the fossil remains that we have are very small. The biggest one we've got is a recently discovered large cranial fragment, but most of the bones would fit on the palm of your hand. In fact, I have a photograph that I put out on Twitter a while ago, which shows the 3D scans of all of the Denisovan remains and the Neanderthal teeth and so on. And they're all sitting just about here in my hand. And so getting direct dates from this material is very difficult because, non-destructive is the way to go. And, if you're carving up bones for things like uranium series, people don't really get too happy about it. So the first challenge that we had when we were working there was to try and date the upper parts of the sediments, and particularly the remains of personal ornaments and artifacts that were excavated in the 3 main chambers of the cave. And then secondly, to try and get an idea of the dates of the human fossil remains. And at the time we were working there, some colleagues of ours from Australia, Bert Roberts and Zenobia Jacobs, were also working using optically stimulated luminescence dating, which can date much, much older things than radiocarbon, back to more than 300 or even 400,000 years ago in some cases. And so working with them in tandem, we were able to build a sort of a composite chronology of how the site built up. When we published our results from the site, we decided that one of the only ways that we could actually date these key fossil remains was to try and use a clever statistical technique based on a Bayesian method to try and do that. And to do this, we incorporated mitochondrial mutation rate information, because as you go through time, mutations build up in the genomes, in the mitochondrial and the nuclear genomes of these organisms, and all organisms, biological organisms, and hominins like Denisovans and Neanderthals are no exception. And so they give you a relative sequence so that you can count the mutations, and you can work out which ones are more recent than others. So we use this additional information, as well as the sediment sequence and the dates we already had, to try and provide numerical age estimates to Denisova 4, Denisova 3, and all of the other important hominin remains. And we succeeded in doing this. And so for the first time, we were able to give age estimates. And so we know now that Denisova 3, the little pinky bone, is just before 50,000 years ago. It's about 52 to 58,000 or 60,000, I forget exactly. And Denisova 4 is about the same age. And this is entirely consistent with their positions, quite high up in the sequence. But interestingly, we also found that our dating estimates gave us different dates for some of the fossil remains that were found a bit lower down, which suggested that they must have moved post-depositionally in the site. And this really brings home the major importance of using the kinds of techniques that we used to get the right dates, because things like these tiny little bones can move post-depositionally in sites like Denisova Cave, which are occasionally, as I say, occupied by things that burrow annoyingly, like hyenas who come and nest in them sometimes.
Well, that is fascinating. So on a related note, and I don't know, we'll see. So I don't think you mentioned this in your book, but when we're talking about Neanderthals and Denisovans, something very recent comes to mind, and that is the Harbin skull.
Yep.
I know dating wise, that's a little far out for radiocarbon, but if we found a younger specimen, do you think that could actually be a Denisovan, or do you think it's a different species?
Yes, this is a really good question. And Seth, the problem with writing a book like this is that damn well that about 6 weeks later, someone's going to publish something that, it may not pull the rug from underneath you, but it may contribute something that you didn't know before. And that's the wonder of science and the great excitement of this field. And as you know, yes, this Harbin Homo longi specimen came out earlier this year, well after the book was initially published. So yes, when I saw this, and especially when you look at the data that's been published regarding the sole M2, the tooth of the Harbin specimen, the sole one that's there, and the way that it's very similar to the Shahe Baixia cave Denisova jawbone, one wonders whether or not this is indeed a Denisovan skull. As you know from the publications that have been put out, there are 3 papers and a commentary, or 2 papers and a commentary, as I recall. The authors tend to look at separation of Neanderthal group, Homo sapiens group, and this Eastern Asian Harbin-based group under Dali and other specimens that have been discovered. And I think, you know, the honest truth is that this is often a conclusion that you reach in paleoanthropology, we do need more data and more information. I mean, for example, from Baixia, it would be great to have a cranial, more extensive cranial bone remains, and from Harbin, it would be great to have more jawbone material. And it's only then, I think, that we can really put flesh onto the bones of these 2 discoveries, the Denisovans on the one hand, and this potential new Homo longi or Homo daliensis, or whatever it is you want to call it, specimen, to see whether or not they actually are within that single lineage, and whether they have, or whether they're distinct and different. I remain really agnostic about this. I think it could be either of the 2. We know from the Denisovan genetics that there is complexity in these populations, and that there is a great deal of time that separates some of the different lineages that we've got. I mean, as I write about in the book, based on the genetics work that's been undertaken by people like Murray Cox and latterly others, the potential there is for definitely 2, but perhaps even 3 different Denisovan populations. Some of them separated from one another such a long time ago that they could even be considered to be separate lineages. We just don't have the physical evidence for that yet. But if you imagine Denisovans and Neanderthals on the one hand, there could even be, you know, when you're looking at just Denisovans, a Denisovan group that is even more separable from Neanderthals than the current Denisovans are. So in that sense, I think we have to tread carefully when we're looking at Homo longi, at this dragon man. And we need to wait until there is more data, particularly the genetics. I think it would be fantastic if some of these enigmatic Chinese fossils could produce DNA. They seem to be failing at a remarkable rate. But equally, having more specimens discovered in context is crucial. We need to be much more confident about when and who these guys were, what their material culture was, what they were making, what they were subsisting on. A whole range of different questions comes up. And so whilst it's extremely exciting, there's still more that we need to know before we can be confident about whether Dragon Man is a Denisovan or not. Personally, I think it's more likely that it is. I think that if we're looking at this bigger picture, I think Eastern Eurasia is Denisovan country, and Western Eurasia is Neanderthal country. And whilst there may be more complications in Eurasia based upon geography, and by that I mean that in places like Melanesia or island Southeast Asia, it's more likely that you do have distinct separated lineages of Denisovans. I think it's more likely on the continental scale in places like China that we may be looking more at Denisovans and sort of subpopulations of Denisovans rather than completely separate groups. I think it's more likely. But as I say, I'm agnostic and I don't know the answer to these questions yet.
Definitely a fair answer. I know a lot of us are wondering and really thinking about what this could be. So going back to radiocarbon dating, because I know a lot of people are very interested in this, but oftentimes I've come across that people do not really understand it. So, you know, I know it all involves the half-life of carbon, blah, blah, blah. Can you explain the mechanics of carbon dating?
Yes, that's right. Radiocarbon is created up in the upper part of the atmosphere, and it's created by cosmic rays that come through space. And these little particles from vestigial remains of the Big Bang when they hit the upper part of our atmosphere, they impact particles in that space. And sometimes they impact other particles, and they produce cosmic neutrons. And these neutrons can sometimes hit nitrogen-14. And when they do, they hit nitrogen-14, they emit a proton on that nitrogen-14 atom. And that chemically converts the nitrogen-14 into carbon-14. So that's the creation pathway. Now, soon after carbon-14 is created, it's oxidized, so it turns into CO2. And then it enters the Earth's biological systems through photosynthesis predominantly, but also through an exchange with the oceans and the atmosphere interface. And so all living organisms then take up this radioactive carbon, but it's present at a very low percentage. 1 in a trillion atoms of carbon in the world is carbon-14, so very low level. And pretty much the level of C14 in the world is similar, regardless of where you are. There are some notable exceptions to this, but for the point of this discussion, we can assume that it's roughly the same. So all living organisms take up this carbon-14, and they have it in equilibrium until death. And once death occurs, there's of course no more food taken up, no more photosynthesis. And so the level of radiocarbon then begins to decay away according to the half-life, as you mentioned, which is just over 5,500 years old. And so gradually the exponential curve ticks in. Every 5,500 years, half the radiocarbon disappears, another 5,500, another half. And so by the time you get back to 10 half-lives, that's 10 times 5,500, you were around 50 to 55,000 years ago, and that's the end of our date range. In the last few years, the radiocarbon method has been really improved by what we call calibration. So we now have the ability to convert our radiocarbon dates into real time. And this is necessary because when we remember those cosmic rays that come through space, the sun, when it's very active, influences the amount of cosmic rays that come through space, and therefore the creation of C14. So when the sun's really active, less C14. When the sun's really quiet, more C14 is created. And this means that there's a fluctuation through time of the amount of radiocarbon that's produced. And so to get over that, we've had to develop calibration curves made up predominantly of tree rings of known age that go from today back to around 14,000 years ago. And then beyond that, other methods can be used, like lake sediment dating, like dating corals that also have rings in them, and speleothems, a range of different things. So we've now got the ability to date things back to 55,000 years ago, which is fantastic, and which gives us the ability to date this key period, from about 30 to 55, when we've got at the end of Neanderthals, probably Denisovans too, although perhaps they hang on for a little bit longer. And this really important period where the late surge of humans, modern humans coming out of Africa and dispersing through into Eurasia. So it's a fantastic method. Sometimes I wish it could be a little bit older, but we now have these other techniques that we can also use too. And there are a range of these. And so one of the things that I've been doing over the last few years is to try and incorporate these other techniques so that when we get to the very limit of radiocarbon, we can extend our chronologies and date things that are older. And rather like at Denisova Cave, which I mentioned before, this has now given us the ability to take different dating methods and combine them together using these Bayesian statistical models, and thereby build much more reliable and tight chronologies than we've ever been able to do before, and start to ask these questions. Were these guys living at the same time? Were they overlapping? Were they contemporaneous? When did Neanderthals disappear? We now have a much better idea of this because of these developments, A, in the chemical pre-treatment of samples for radiocarbon, and B, in the application of Bayesian methods and building calibrated models in order to provide much more reliable and precise dates.
That's great. I know, when radiocarbon dating was first discovered, it was not, as you mentioned, what it is today. And it's definitely one of those things that scientists have. When they find something, they kind of put it in a drawer and wait a few years for technology to improve enough to learn about it. So I'm very glad to hear that radiocarbon dating is getting to the point where we're reaching its limits, though. But
it's getting better. It's getting better. I mean, if you look at 10 years ago, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, when we redated some of these sites that have been dated in the 90s using updated and improved methods, we found that there were some big differences. When we dated bones again and we dated charcoal samples again, because they weren't properly decontaminated. So at one site, I found that of all of the dates that had been obtained previously, more than 75% of them were actually wrong. They were too young usually. And it's not until the early 2000s that radiocarbon accelerators like Oxford's, we were able to actually date samples beyond 40,000. And so if you can imagine, we're dating stuff, let's say, that has a real age of between 40 and 50,000, but our dating limit is 40,000. You can imagine there's a lot of underestimated ages in those kind of situations. And so now we've got even better methods and even better accelerators to date these very old samples. And we're much more confident now that than ever before that we're getting reliable dates. And we get these confirmations sometimes. So there's some really exciting stuff that's coming out about dating using DNA and genetics. And so, for example, if you imagine you have integration of DNA from one hominin to another, and so the first generation of that integration has 50-50 split of DNA between those two, but then subsequent generations will perhaps only be breeding, as it were, between those single group, that single species of human. And so the DNA from that integration will break up and recombine through time. And it's possible to date using these recombination statistics. It's possible to date the integration dates using these new techniques. And we can compare those estimates with our radiocarbon estimates. And there was a very interesting paper that came out a few years ago about this, where Priya Moyani and colleagues showed that the radiocarbon dates and the Bayesian tip dates, or the integration dates, were pretty much the same. So we have independent confirmation where possible, and using other techniques as well that give us a lot more confidence in these dates now than we ever had before, which is exciting.
Definitely. So in your opinion, do you think everything, I guess, between a certain range should be redated that we have, like fossil wise? And I mean, like, how inaccurate do you think these issues are? Like, how deep do they go?
Yeah, so what we found was that when we looked at previous dates where the bone collagen levels were very low, so they were getting very small amounts of collagen, we found that the biggest differences when we redated those specimens with those types of samples. And so we have managed to redate a lot of those already, and to check that they're okay and reliable. Our lab in Oxford, we probably do about 25% of all of the dates from the Paleolithic on that type of material. And so we have a lot of material that we've worked on and redated, and we published a lot of papers recently that show the results of this redating. I think it pays to tread carefully, and it pays where possible to try and redate samples. There's a lot of new work that's going on that shows that in many cases these outlying dates, these younger than expected dates, surprisingly younger than expected dates, are usually the ones to focus on first and show that those are wrong. But the bulk of the dates that have been done in the last decade and a half, I would say, are usually pretty good. When we're looking at more recent parts of the radiocarbon timescale, the situation is much better. So because of the much reduced impact of contamination. So from the Neolithic and the Mesolithic, these dates are pretty robust. Very hard to get these wrong. The Paleolithic is really the focus of a lot of redating work. But as I say, I think the present situation is very bright. The future is very bright. The techniques we're now using are much better, and I think that as long as radiocarbon scientists are careful and they don't date things that have very low levels of collagen, that as I say, the future looks pretty good in terms of our ability to date these really important sites.
And I think that is so important and crucial. Now, shifting gears a little bit, as an anthropology professor, I ask this of almost all my guests, and sometimes it is a very difficult question to answer. What is your favorite hominin?
You mean an individual one or a species? Or
species.
Oh, it has to be Denisovans, because I've become so close to them. And working at Denisova Cave, it's one of the great privileges of my life, and working with the guys that have been toiling there for the last, God, well, they've been there since the 1980s, some of them, is really great. And I think that the thing about the Denisovans is they're so enigmatic and they're really mysterious. And, you know, where we have lots of Neanderthal specimens and we have many, you know, human Homo sapiens specimens, and, you know, in Eurasia at least, we have virtually no Denisovans. And so I think I'd have to say Denisovans, actually. Although we don't have a holotype and we don't have, you know, an actual species name, and in a way I'm kind of cheating. If I could say, oh yeah, Homo altaiensis would be it, but of course we can't say that because we don't have the definitive holotype. So it's frustrating. And I hope very soon that someone will find it. Who knows? Maybe it's Dragon Man, but of course that's already been, a previous name would take precedence over that. So we can't really call it Homo altaiensis. And maybe, you know, it may be that one day there is no name for Denisovans. Maybe they just subsumed in some other holotype. But nonetheless, Denisovans would be my favorite. And not a day goes by that I don't hope that next week there'll be something more than we know about them, and maybe a bigger specimen. Dream big, and hopefully it may come to fruition.
Definitely. And I know Denisovans have captured the imagination of many paleoanthropologists, being so elusive, as you mentioned.
Yeah, definitely.
So, as a professor, what advice would you give new and intrigued students, and also just enthusiasts, on what to look out for, what to get started with?
In terms of like career and so on?
In terms of just the best ways to go about learning these things for now.
Okay.
We'll focus on that.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I think that despite the massive negative experience we've had over the last couple of years in terms of you know, lockdowns and pandemics and so on, one of the I guess benefits of this has been the ability of people in all parts of the world to be able to tune in and listen and interact with academics that are working in this field and others. And you know, I've been involved in lots of really exciting you know, online conferences and seminars, both listening to and giving, and it's been a really great experience. So I think, you know, one thing that people can do is to take advantage of that. To follow, I think Twitter is a wonderful resource because it gives you the ability to really be in touch firsthand with what's going on. And there is not a day that goes by that I don't find something of interest. So I think that social media angle, and whether it's Facebook or Twitter, I think for me, work-wise, Twitter's better because I have good connections there. Looking at what people are doing, listening to their conversations, becoming involved in those conversations is a really great thing to be doing. And of course also listening in and attending online lectures and talks and seminar series is a great thing to do. I think also, you know, once things get, perhaps if they ever do get back to more of a normality, then being able to travel and being able to visit sites is a terrific thing to do. If you're a young student, I know that if you're in an American university, often you have to pay quite a lot of money to be able to attend a field school. That's as part of your undergraduate class. But you know, that's not necessarily the case that you have to do that. There are lots of excavations that are ongoing that are always calling for volunteers and visitors, people to come and help. And there are many across Europe which put out calls. And so you should, if you're interested, ask for some advice on that. Contact some of the principal excavators that are actively working in the field and see whether you can pop along and spend a month or two. It's a great experience, and you know, you can really learn a great deal by actually being in the field and excavating and participating. And you know, you never know, you might find something pretty spectacular. So I think those would be the main things that I would say at the moment. Although, as I say, with the latter, with the field work, it's very, very difficult at the moment. Although there are field teams out there working at the moment in some parts of the world, that's not applicable and it's not possible. because of the disparate nature of the vaccination process. And I think it's very important that we stay away from countries in our privileged situation. It's very important that we in the West stay away from countries that have not yet been privileged enough or lucky enough to get vaccinated to the same levels that we are. We should stay away and not do field work. But in countries where it's possible, I think it's a good thing to do.
And then, so I just had the question. When we're talking about, oh, it's completely gone. Moving on. So
what's your advice to people, Seth? What would you be telling people at the moment?
That's, no one has ever asked me a question.
I'll take the opportunity.
So if you were to ask me, as someone who is very new to this and is very, relatively new on the scene, I have found that the most crucial thing to getting an understanding about paleoanthropology, and really any subject, is to be passionate about it.
Absolutely, yes.
If you don't have a passion, you're not going to have the drive or the enthusiasm to meet those goals.
Yeah.
And, and that's okay if it's not your passion, but if it is, you're gonna make it, and you're gonna, like you said, you're going to attend all the online events. I know I try to watch as many as I can. And, a lot of people think you need a formal education, which, depend for work, sometimes you do, and depending on where you're going and what you're doing. But I like to remind people, like, Richard Leakey did not, go to a university. He did not do those things. So there is room for just enthusiasm. And
yes, absolutely. I agree completely. I think that's really true. And as I said before, there's so much information, MOOCs and so on the internet, and the ability to really get into a subject in great detail that it really opens the door for a great deal of enthusiasts and amateurs to become involved and get interested and to play a part. One of the things that I really was excited to talk about in the book is the number of people who find things, and instead of just like throwing them out and saying, oh, that's probably nothing, or let's just leave it, they take them to, and they show someone, and they take an interest, and they end up finding something that's tremendously significant in paleoanthropological terms. I mean, we were just talking before about Shahe, this amazing site on the Tibetan plateau, where Denisovan remains supposedly, still more work, but the Denisovan sediments and this Denisovan thought to be Denisovan jawbone was discovered, and that was found by a monk who was praying in the cave. And one day, as the custom is, they take a handful of soil out from the cave with them, and he noticed this funny looking bone sitting there. And instead of sort of throwing it away, he took it to his lama, and the lama took it and kept it because he too could see that it was human looking. And that was then later, 25 years later, delivered into the hands of a local scientist from the nearby university. And then from then on into two others, and then into Jean-Jacques Coublin from the Max Planck, who with those Chinese colleagues then published this fantastic paper that appeared in Nature at the beginning of 2019. So 2020, I should say. So, amateurs and people who have no formal education can play a significant role, even in the basis of the discoveries like that.
Definitely. And I think encouraging that is something that is the responsibility of those that are in the field. And I'm fortunate to say that everyone that I've met so far have just been some of the kindest, most open people who just really, that passion I mentioned, I've seen it in all these people's eyes, yours included. This search for shared human origins is just so important. And I mean, personally, I can't get away from it. It's just on my mind constantly. And, I think the future is very bright.
Absolutely, I agree. I think you put it very, very nicely there. This enthusiasm, this keenness, and this sort of wonder at how all of this unfolded and how we came to be here is part of this. It's an innate curiosity that I think many humans have. Not all humans, but luckily the ones that we talk to a lot, and the ones that we call friends. And that's why it's such a great field to be involved in there, finding things and sharing them with people and seeing their excitement and their interest, and feeling that yourself when you see something published or something that's shown to you that you've never seen before. It's just, it makes life really exciting and worth living in that sense, doesn't it?
Oh, 100%. And with that, I think I will let you go because I do have to get to work. So I will thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciated having you on here, and you are welcome to come back anytime. I will be writing and posting my review of your book in the very near future, and I'll definitely post links to purchasing that, etc. And I had a great time.
Thank you, Seth. It's been a pleasure, and I'm really honored to be a guest with you, and following you with great interest on Twitter, as others should be. Keep up the good work, and many thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for adventuring with us into the human past. If you've enjoyed this video, check out our website at www.worldofpaleoanthropology.org and find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.